Born into servitude, the Global Slavery Index says millions worldwide are trapped and Asian countries top the list. So why does the problem persist? What are governments doing to curb it? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the show. I'm Sami Zeidan. 45 million people around the world are trapped in modern slavery, and that's just the estimate. The true total could be much higher. Workers enslaved to pay off debts, women trafficked into prostitution or forced to become domestic servants. Modern-day slavery is thriving, we're told, and very profitable for some, says the Global Slavery Index. It's published by the Australian Walk Free Foundation, which campaigns to stamp out the slave trade. Well, judging by their latest study of 167 countries, there's a long way to go. So many millions around the world forced to work against their will. Is there any hope of ending their bondage? Well, nearly 60% of all people considered to be modern slaves live in just 5 countries. India has the most, with more than 18 million in bonded slavery. China has nearly 3.5 million, we're told. Pakistan is estimated to have 2 million. Bangladesh has 1.5 million. Well, finally, it's thought Uzbekistan has 1.25 million modern-day slaves. We're joined now by our panel. Let's bring our guests into the show. From London, we have the founder of the Global Slavery Index, Andrew Forrest, who represents the Walk Free Foundation. From Geneva, we have Aidan McQuade, who's the director of Anti-Slavery International. And also joining us from London is Kevin Bales, who's a professor of contemporary slavery at the University of Hull. Good to have you with us. If I could start then with Aidan. You know, one important point, I think, which is really important to clear up at the beginning, is modern slavery, as defined in reports like this, declining or increasing in 2016? Where do we stand?
It's practically impossible to say. It's only over the past 5, 10, 15 years that there's been any sort of significant and rigorous approach towards looking at the problem. So there's various methodologies used by different organizations, Global Slavery Index being one, the International Labour Organization being others, which are trying to get to grips with what the scale of the problem is. My suspicion is that what we're actually doing at the moment is getting a better sense of just what's been going on for a very long time. The Irish anti-slavery activist Roger Casement once said that slavery was never really abolished, it was just deregulated, and because of that it's become something which has begun to emerge into the background and being difficult to get a proper handle on in terms of its scale.
All right, emerging into the background. It's interesting you use that word. Kevin, are we seeing a situation at least arise now where reporting and documenting what's considered to be modern-day slavery is improving, and that's why we're hearing more about it?
That's certainly one of the reasons why we're hearing more about it. And it is true that our ability to measure this crime is improving every year. But I have to remind you, it's a hidden crime. It's hard to get at, and in a lot of countries it's hidden so well that you really have serious difficulties getting to the true numbers. The number this year in the Global Slavery Index is significantly higher than the last edition, but we don't necessarily believe that that means that the amount of slavery is increasing. We believe that our microscope is becoming much more sharp, much better focused. So for that reason, it means we're getting there, but it's going to take several more years, I think, until we have the kind of ground truthing and the longitudinal measurements that allow us to make real metrics that will help us to determine whether we're making real progress.
Interesting. Kevin, of course, you worked on this. This is your initiative. How easy is it, though, to define what constitutes modern-day slavery? That's not a straightforward definition, is it, Kevin?
No, I think it is a very straightforward definition. You know, slavery today is not really that different to slavery in the past. It's not legal anymore. It's deregulated, as Aidan was saying. But if you ask, you know, what was the fundamental nature of slavery in the past, what's the fundamental nature of slavery today, It's about one person being under the complete control of another person. Violence and coercion is used to maintain that control. That control is used to exploit someone economically or sexually or for other reasons. I mean, that totality of control gives us a good indication of what type of slavery we're talking about and whether it is or is not slavery.
Okay, let's bring Andrew into the discussion. Of course, your foundation is the one that also released this index. How easy, I mean, is it when you get into some of the aspects of the definition, such as bonded labor, workers who are working in debt? Gosh, that's, I mean, you could imagine a lot of workers in many parts of the world start to wonder whether they're in slavery when you get into the fine-tuning of this, couldn't you?
No, and look, I'm sure many people at Al Jazeera would jump on that bandwagon too, but if I'd pull you up and say, they're likely to pay off their debt, they're likely to pay off their homes, could take them 5, 10, maybe 25 years. Mm-hmm. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about debts which will never go away, which they will never pay off, and which keeps them totally under the pure servitude, treated like a farm animal. They can never leave of somebody else. And it's just a device, it's just another modern day slavery device.
Now, I understand, Andrew, you were a very successful businessman in Australia and you employed people in conditions which you felt could be described as modern slavery. I mean, what prompted you to take a stance against it and have a complete shift in track?
To be absolutely clear, I went searching for modern day slavery within my supply chains. Yes, I have founded a very large company. It's one of the largest mining companies in the world. It's called Forrest Metals Group. It is proud of its integrity, but I saw child trafficking with my own eyes and the threads of it all around the world through the very, very tragic eyes of my then 15-year-old daughter, who saw children and experienced the tremendous pain of kids who had been either rescued from child sex trafficking or had been lost into the industry. That really woke me up to the existence of modern day slavery. I then started looking at it harder. I met people like Professor Bales, and they assured me that unfortunately child sex slavery, child trafficking was only a subset of modern slavery, and I should look a lot further. I began to look further and saw forced labour of men, women and children as being the much bigger proportion. And that's when I started to search my own supply chains. We have 3,500 suppliers, and we found many of them had great difficulty answering a simple question with an oath from their chief executive saying, we've looked at our first and second order supply chains and there's no slavery. Now, with all those companies who couldn't answer that question, couldn't make an oath that they could stay a Fortescue client, we then went and had a look at them. Many had very, very suspect practices, but some, and one in particular, had imported thousands and thousands of South Indian workers into deserts where these huge workshops were manufacturing goods for me and hundreds of other major companies around the world. So they all have slavery in their supply chains. And that's when I decided to say, right, I'll step down from this wonderful company and I'll devote my life to doing my small bit to ending slavery.
That's a fascinating situation then. And I wonder, Aidan, what is the solution for a problem which is so complex like that exists with the participation of many parties on many levels?
I mean, currently I'm in Geneva at the International Labour Conference, and one of the reasons for that is we're discussing this week the possibility of establishing an international law on decent work and global supply chains, because I think it's wrong to say that slavery is everywhere illegal today. And truth of the matter is, in large parts of the world, it's legalized or de facto legalized. In India, it is facilitated by the caste system, which allows, or which means that rule of law simply doesn't exist for about 300 million Indians, and it can be abused in any way, shape or form that more powerful and wealthier business folk wish. Across the Arabian Peninsula, including Qatar, we see the kafala system, which facilitates private individuals into exploiting up to and including forced labour of migrant workers, which means that it's likely that the World Cup in 2022 is going to be the bloodiest sporting event since Julius Caesar's funeral games. In the UK, there's very similar systems of forced labour for particularly overseas domestic workers. So we're allowing ourselves this comforting myth that slavery is a thing of the past, that it's something that's illegal. But if you look a little more closely at the way in which the global political economy is structured, we see that there's a lot of loopholes and laws which are there to facilitate slavery, sometimes deliberately, or sometimes the consequences, the unintended consequences of them, are to facilitate slavery. What we need to see is a closer forensic approach to these rules and laws so that they're changed to exclude slavery from international supply chains, from the way in which
Aidan,
countries seek to do business.
Can rules and regulations then really be the solution? If, as you've mentioned, you mentioned a broad range of countries, and all of them would make the argument that they have laws, they have regulations. The UK's got its Modern Day Slavery Act. Qatar says it's brought out a whole bunch of regulations to improve worker conditions. India has gone through social transformation and has a lot of laws and regulations, and yet this problem still exists. Can more rules on the books really be the solution?
No, perhaps maybe I can help here. If I could just jump in.
Go ahead.
It's not the only solution. Can I finish? It's not the. Thank you for.
No, please,
it's not the only
please.
solution, but it is part of the solution, because a lot of these countries are not telling the truth in terms of, are they addressing the fundamental issues there.
Okay, let's give a chance now for Andrew to weigh in.
Look, I haven't had the joy of meeting Aidan, but I haven't heard so much common sense in in such a short time for a long while. I'm actually supporting everything Aidan said. What I would like to bring into this picture is what the Modern Slavery Bill 2015 in the UK has done, and that's to bring responsibility to business. And I'm, of course, part of that large business community. I know that if governments encourage businesses to feel safe, to do what I did, to go and search your supply chains, send out affidavits to all your suppliers, ask them to absolutely sign it, and then be prepared, if they're going to stay a service provider or goods provider to you, to endure spot audits. Now, business in conjunction with government can be enormously powerful. Government in conjunction with business can be enormously powerful. If we bring the power of global business, encouraged by governments, made to feel safe by governments, that if they search their supply chains, it could be, as Aidan said, from Qatar, it could be from anywhere else, it could be from the Middle East or India. But if we know that it's safe to find and declare that we've found modern day slavery in our supply chains, and have media actually highlight that as good governance, as proper management, and it's those chief executives which have looked me in the eye and said they will never look for slavery in their supply chains just in case they find it. They are the executives who are standing on a burning platform and which must be held to account.
All right, that's very interesting for Kevin, because from Andrew's perspective, I think what he's saying is the importance of the business community stepping in. I mean, in the example which Andrew gave, change happened because somebody within the business community, i.e. himself, said, let's look at our own supply chains. Without that responsibility being taken by the business community in a very complex production and distribution world that we live in today, can there really be effective change?
Oh, yes, there can be effective change. And some of it will come from the business community. Some of it will be the regulation upon the business community that we've just been talking about in the new law in Britain. But it's also important to remember that a lot of slavery does not feed into the global supply chain, and there is a place where we have to look carefully at particularly the non-governmental organizations and some governmental organizations who do the work of direct enforcement of the laws against slavery and the direct work of intervening to bring slavery to an end and begin that rehabilitation and reintegration process for the people who have been in slavery. There's no single answer to this. You can't fix it with a rock concert. You can't fix it with a single law. You can't fix it even with hundreds of thousands of campaigners on the ground. It's going to have to be all of those things together to make the real difference.
All right, but enlighten us here, Kevin. What are some of the other forms of slavery that you're referring to that feed into the bigger picture, which are not part of a global supply chain, lest we become too focused on the economics of this?
Well, there's a lot of slavery that occurs that just feeds into local markets, local agriculture in South Asia, in parts of South and Central America. I mean, I've been in camps where children were enslaved to do processing of fish that had been caught off the coast of Bangladesh. Most of that fish was not going into the global supply chain. It was going into local markets, though some of it would end up in cat food, some of it would end up in fish stock cubes and things like that. But there's plenty of that. And of course, if you're enslaving a domestic worker in Haiti and West Africa and other parts of the world, including the rich parts of the world, that person is not necessarily contributing into a global supply chain unless you consider it the global supply and chain leading to the enslavement of people themselves.
Interesting. Aidan, 60% of modern slavery, we're told by this index, is in 5 countries, all of them in Asia. Why is that?
Certainly in South Asia, a central reason that there is so much slavery there is the caste system. I think we forget too readily in the West and in non-South Asian countries just what a brutal apartheid-like system that is. And the consequence of it is that while India has got an exceptionally fine constitution and some very decent law against slavery, and similarly in Pakistan, Nepal and other parts of South Asia, the caste system means that it's not applied for those who are most vulnerable to slavery, so they don't get their basic protections under the constitution and under the law. Similarly, in Uzbekistan, we see extremely rich elite, parts of which are in the government, who have established a system of state-sponsored forced labour within it. Human beings like to inflict violence on other human beings. That's a sad truth of our history, but law, policy, decency can stop that, but we're not seeing enough of that being applied across the world. And too often we're seeing too many governments which are failing to confront other governments which we know are carrying out abuses. The UK government says it wishes to be a world leader against slavery, and yet it is scrambling after trade deals with India in spite of the fact that the supply chains there are rife with forced labour and with child labour.
I'm curious to know, Andrew, when you go through these kinds of stats and you see the sort of examples which you research, is culture part of the problem here then? That it's not just business, it's not just rules and regulations, you're really up against changing parts of culture and the way people look at each other.
Yeah, and look, don't think for a second that that's impossible. I appreciate that is very difficult, but you know, I've seen the same India which Aidan has, which Kevin has. We have, though, and I speak very personally now, seen, particularly in the last few years, at the grassroots level, a growing understanding of what freedom means. And you know, I see a ripple effect across India, which I've never seen in the decades, the 35 years I've been going there, I've never seen this. And
what's prompted it then, Andrew?
Well, look, it's an understanding that freedom is a natural right for every Indian. Now, people simply don't know that, but steps are being taken so they do. Only recently, the great religious leaders of India came together, unprecedented, and formed a declaration against modern-day slavery. They did 3 things which were critically important. One, they said modern slavery exists in India, so no mucking around, no fudging it, just modern slavery exists in India. 2, we're going to bring those 2 words into the Indian lexicon. They haven't existed before. If you shield something, if you pretend it isn't there, you've hardly got a word for it. Now, modern slavery exists as of that religious meeting, and they went out to their hundreds of millions of supporters each, all over India, and said, modern slavery is in the Indian lexicon. It's okay for you to recognise it and say it. And the 3rd thing I found equally powerful, you've got a government there which abhors, absolutely hates modern slavery, but in some ways needs huge community support to enforce their own will. Now, religious leaders, faith leaders can help really provide that support. And when they said, we accept that slavery is absolutely part of our history, absolutely part of our society, what we do not accept anymore is that it's going to be a part of our future. And we want everyone to know, whether you're a Zoroastrian or a Jain, a Christian, you know, Sunni, Shia, Hindu, it doesn't matter. Slavery is now in India's past. And if you are still a slave master in India, then we will come looking for you. Now, that's words I've never heard in the decades that I've been going to India. It's reflected by the words of Prime Minister Modi. It's reflected by the Minister for Women and Children, where there's this virulent hatred towards slavery, this determination towards slavery coming to an end, which I haven't seen before and which gives me much greater confidence in India as a global investor, as a humanitarian rights activist. I believe India could well be on the cusp of major change.
That's a nice positive thought. Well, it's nice to get something positive out of a discussion like this on such a hard topic. If I could come back to Aidan, you're with the ILO conference right now. You're looking at supranational initiatives. What about linking up with the community? After all, this is the age of the internet, we're told, social media, social activism. Is there a way to connect with the grassroots in order to combat modern-day slavery?
Well, that's centrally what we as Anti-Slavery International do. We try and connect our colleagues who are working on the ground with the international institutions. And last night I was listening to a representative of the Indian government who was describing a workers' nirvana, a paradise for all people who were seeking decent work. And unfortunately, whenever we compare that with the reality, which we see day in, day out, there's an enormous gap between the two, and it was underpinned just in the past week with the government announcing plans for a new law which is going to make it much, much more difficult for people to free themselves from slavery situations. I mean, there's basic things that we need to see happening in countries like India. We need to see an increase in the capacity of the judiciary. We need to see a decent labour inspection system happening. We need to see decent policing happening. And we need to see all of this happening with the repudiation of the discrimination which occurs under the vestiges of caste. It's a long way to go. I mean, there's a lot of flaws in India. The government's announcing some more against slavery, but I don't think there's any indications at the moment that the laws that are going to be introduced are going to be applied with any more vigour than the existing anti-slavery laws, which are plentiful and on India's statute books. So I very much hope that what Andrew says is correct and true, but I'm
You're a little more sceptical by the sound of it.
I suppose a realistic pessimist about this. A bit more sceptical, but one always has to hope. Otherwise, one would never keep at this sort of work.
All right, let me give Andrew a chance. He wanted to come back in. Are you being a little too optimistic, Andrew?
No, look, I think Aidan absolutely has the experience. He's got every right to hold those beliefs. He's got every right to hold India accountable. What gives me the faith is that when I go and speak to, and I've spoken, I don't know if it's hundreds, if not maybe more now, of people coming out of slavery or in slavery or in the turning point to get out of slavery, there's a real hope there. I've spoken to great-grandfathers and grandfathers who are used to generations, and the caste system, I'm afraid, which Aidan's spoken of, alive and well, and they're used to generations of being treated like farm animals or worse. And they're now saying to me with glassy eyes, my grandchild will never suffer the life I did.
Okay.
And we're seeing, you know, little things happening like payments being made to people who have been in bonded labour or been in modern-day slavery in India, actual physical payments. No, they're not great, but they are being spread across India, and that's a first. So that's every time that payment gets made, modern-day slavers, the slave masters are being put on notice.
We got about a minute left, so I want to give it, if I may, to Kevin. You know, everybody seems, we're hearing governments are bringing out regulations that are against this. Some in the social media world are trying to organise campaigns against this. Where is the resistance coming from then? Is it the business middlemen? Because if it's, as we were hearing from Andrew, perhaps some of the top corporations, they're not in on this in the sense that it's supporting, they're maybe turning a blind eye. So where's the resistance coming from? Is it the business middlemen who's making a buck out of this?
Some middlemen are resistant to this, but it's not normally the people in the middle. It's the people closer to the end of the supply chain where the slavery actually exists, where the criminals are working. And usually just one step or two steps above the criminals in the supply chain who are guilty of slavery. There are people who are accessories after the fact, or in a sense co-conspirators, people who know that slavery is going on and yet buy those raw materials, commodities, or products from those people who are using slave labor. They are the people we have to be very concerned about, as well as the slaveholders, because they're the ones who begin to conceal it. And they are the ones who cast the veil over products to make them more difficult to trace.
Right.
Once you get up a little bit on the thing, people don't want to have slavery in their supply chain because they know how bad it would be for their reputation. And there's usually not that much of an increase in profit from using it.
Okay, we're going to have to leave the discussion there because we are out of time. Let's thank our guests, Andrew Forrest, Aidan McQuade, and Kevin Bales. And thank you for watching. Of course, you can see the program again anytime by visiting our website, aljazeera.com. For further discussion, you can head over to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter, our handle @AJ Inside Story. From me, Sami Zeidan, and the whole team here for now, it's goodbye.